Okay, everyone, I've just started the recording. We're waiting just another minute before we get started. Just to orient you, this is our brown bag talk. This will be fairly informal. If you have any questions as we're moving through, please feel free to speak up. But I might not be able to answer them all. We have a short period of time, and if you have something that's real specific to something that you're working on or something that you know that a student is working on, you can always reach out to me through email. But we have a number of colleagues who use single case design research quite a lot, particularly in special education in that department. So you can reach out to any of us. I'm just a person who happens to be here today, but there's a lot of us who could give this presentation. So feel free to reach out with your questions when the time comes. All right, Mete, anything before we get started, now that the time has come?
Yeah, nothing on my end. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, thanks you guys for attending. This is a presentation that will be an overview of the basics, some of the variations, and a few application ideas for single case design. I'm going to be sharing this presentation with you when it's over, and it is far longer than I'm going to review today. And that's for a reason. I know that some of you are interested in single case design, but maybe haven't had the background or don't know about some of the standards. And when the time comes for you to actually use it, you're going to need way more resources than I can share with you in this short presentation. So I'm going to give you some of that in the presentation itself, but I may not cover it today. It will be in slides that I will either, track over a little quickly, or I will leave at the end. I've left quite a few on the quality standards at the end, so you can look at that on your own time and reach out if you have questions. So let's talk about, So let's talk about why single case design. Unique advantages of this design, and maybe why it's been used so frequently in special education research. Does anybody already know this and want to share, like, hey, I use single case and this is why it's a unique design for capturing what we want to know? Go for it, Stephanie.
Well, I work with individuals with intellectual disabilities, and because that population is pretty small, it's very difficult to get a large enough N to do more group design. So I use a lot of single case design in my research because of that.
Yeah, great example. So we can be thinking of that one as we move through. If you have other reasons why and you want to share them with the group, feel free to throw it in the chat. Thank you, Stephanie. So why is it called single case design? A lot of folks think that it may be confusing, and single case does not always involve one individual participant. It also can be confused with case studies as a separate design, which would be more qualitative in nature, not quantitative, which is the single case design relies on quantitative data. So it could be confusing in that way. Does anybody have anything to share about that? About single case design as opposed to case studies? Has anybody ever confused that themselves or seen it confused out in the world? David Owens?
I'm honestly not familiar with single case design. And so that's why I'm here. I'm confused about what it is. Is it one person? Is it like one scenario? Even case studies sometimes confuse me as something could be a case study if it's like an experimental design, but we're thinking about the same type of intervention, but maybe doing it different ways or something. And so that was something I was hoping I could gather from what you guys are providing today, just a little bit more clarity on what it is, so I know when and how I could use it.
Great, thank you so much. That's perfect, because what we're going to talk about today are the different aspects of what single case design, and sometimes, it can be called single subject sometimes out in the field, and that can be confusing because there can definitely be multiple subjects in a single case. So we want to clarify some of that language for you, and then moving forward, just see what questions you have about the design process from there when you go to use it yourself. So first things first, one of the things that distinguishes this is it's quantitative and experimental. We're going to talk about some of the smaller dimensions of that and what that means. But single case design research relies on numerical data and mostly sort of smaller populations who produce this numerical data to describe a particular intervention or a particular instance of change. It demonstrates a causal relationship, which is another thing that's commonly misunderstood. It's supposed to show you replications of an effect, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that lead toward proving a causal relationship by taking that data and pulling in data from other places, other replications in the country with different sets of researchers, and talking about those effects on a larger scale to produce evidence-based practices. So that's a very distinguishing factor of single case design research. What's an effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable? That is the big question. Okay, so there's an independent variable, something that we're choosing to isolate. We try to control for the rest as much as reasonably possible, and then watching what effect that has on the measure that we chose. It is frequently quasi-experimental, and that's because random assignment to treatment is rarely logical in single case design. When you are pulling out participants to and say that I am interested in students with intellectual disabilities in IPSEs or in post-secondary education, I'm going to have a very small set of individuals that I have access to in the first place. I also am going to be very invested in the individualization of the implementation of whatever I'm doing. It's not going to be best practices if I'm trying to sort of treat all these students' needs in the same way when their needs are different. So we're really interested in quasi-experimental research for a lot of our questions because we need and are invested in a purposeful assignment to an intervention as opposed to a random one. The last piece I want to talk about, which we'll talk about here in a second, is no control group. So instead of a control group, there is still a control, but instead the student themselves or the individual case or scenario serves as its own control. So you're establishing a baseline when you establish experimental control. And using baseline logic to try to demonstrate that the dependent variable changed due to the independent variable. The experimental control in single case design research is demonstrated through replications. So 3 or more replications of the effect. You're going to see lots of different ways that that's represented in single case design. But when you see an effect that's happening, you want to see that effect repeated, and not repeated simultaneously so that the effect could have been contributed to something else that just happened to be happening. Say it was a Tuesday and it's Taco Tuesday and everybody loves Taco Tuesday. So the effect, jumped because of Taco Tuesday, not because of your intervention. You'll see in a second that the replications being staggered is important, especially with particular designs. And then demonstrating a functional relationship between treatment and behavior. And the functional relationship or functional relation, which is what I should say, there's a lot of researchers that say people have relationships and data have relations. Demonstrating functional relations between the different effects to show, yes, we think that this is causal and we want to move ahead and say it's a functional relationship. So what kinds of replication are we talking about? We might be talking about replication within participants. So this might be, David, you were talking about, is it just one participant? Is it many? Like what's going on there? It can be both, depending on the particular design. So if you chose a reversal design, you may have a single participant who you are finding, establishing baseline, then introducing an intervention, then removing the intervention for that reversal, watching what happens with the effect, then reintroducing the intervention to watch what happens with the effect again. And every time it's introduced, that's a new replication. Okay, so that can take a lot of different forms. It can be alternating treatments where there's a single participant and they're getting different treatments that are switching back and forth, and you're watching between those treatments. We'll talk about multi-elements in just a few minutes. Multiple baseline across behaviors or settings. So if you're going to have a lot of multiple baselines, will use several participants. You know, the standard is 3 to 5, but they can also use a single participant and measure what's happening with them across different behaviors, or across that same behavior, but across different settings. How is this student using this intervention tool in the classroom, in their home environment, and out in the community? Okay, that's another example. It can also be replication between participants. So when there are multiple participants involved, the multiple baseline would be the demonstration of effect with participant 1, the demonstration of effect with participant 2, participant 3, and so on. And usually, like I said, the standard is 3 to 5 participants. There are other designs that we can talk about, and then how each one of these different approaches is either strengthening internal validity, which is basically asking, is the intervention having the effect that we say that it's having, right? Or external validity, which is, now that we've seen this effect, how likely is it that this is going to have a similar effect for other individuals, okay, that are not in this case. So single case design research and applied behavior analysis have strong connections. Whenever you look into the foundational textbooks for single case design, there is a lot of going back to Skinner's work on observable and measurable behavior. But also when you look at ABA textbooks, their legacy of developing interventions to change human behavior is linked very intimately with these designs, okay? Because they're frequently applied with individuals with disabilities and individuals who we don't have a lot of instances where we can gather a lot of people together and we want to know a question that's going to apply to them all, right? We have questions about individual interventions and specific situations. It is also a perfect match for studying individualized teaching applications and behavior management. So that's something to keep in mind, all of us who work with EDS students and know that our students are studying something that's very personal to them, integral to their school, is, you know, possibly those students are going to have smaller numbers and may be interested in this kind of research. So I'm going to talk just a second about special education. I promise I won't do it a lot, but this is where my heart is, right? So we all, I think, that work in special education, but even in education broadly, could use a better understanding of this design, because the primary focus is on teaching individuals versus studying the individual's characteristics, okay? We have strong shared values with psychology about understanding individual differences, but our focus with single case design is on teaching those individuals and what are the effects there. Teachers, especially special educators, need to know how to develop and evaluate teaching interventions on the individual student level. And we know how important this is now that all of our teachers are delving into special education on a regular basis, right? We're all talking about differentiation. We're all talking about individual needs that we need to address to make sure that all students are rising to the levels that we expect. And then we, as a research community, we need continued advocacy about the value and importance of design methodologies that measure the effects for individuals who are outside of the norm. Okay, we have still some work to do there, because this design is very not well understood outside of special education and psychologists who happen to be behavior analysts. Okay, those are the folks who single case design is their bag. They know all about it. So this is also just in recent literature. I just want to connect you back. If you want to keep digging here, This was just published recently by Sam Odom, and he works a lot with single case design. He took a look at randomized control trials and the limitations that randomized control trial studies are having when they're informing school-based intervention. So if you want to delve in more, I pulled that resource for you. You can take a look. So let's talk for just a second together about the logic of each one of these components. Let's talk about the logic of using baselines. Okay, so we have to convey this to students quite a lot. Baselines are important because they help us to predict and verify what is happening in the current condition before we introduce a change. Okay, so there is going to be that independent variable, but before we introduce the independent variable, we need to be able to use this as prediction and verification so that when we see a change, we can judge that against our prediction and then verify, especially when it's across various repetitions of baseline. When we're returning to baseline, we want to be able to verify what we thought was true without the intervention, or verify it across participants' settings. We want to know when we introduce the intervention for participant 1, is there a change with participant 2 as well? Because they have not been introduced to intervention and there should not be a change, right? So that's just baseline logic, one of the foundations of single case design. What substitutes for a control group? Instead of a control group, we have the individual. They serve as their own control. So showing baseline is the control for this experimentation. Why is replication critical? Replication is demonstrating experimental control over the independent variable. And finally, how are the data analyzed? This is also something that is, special about single case design. The data are analyzed visually. We graph the data and then we use specific indicators, which we'll talk about in a second, to judge the effect and take a look at the change. Is the change a significant change? What limitations do we have? Where do we want to go from here? So let's talk about data analysis in this single case design. This example is multiple baseline or multiple probe. And I'm just putting this here as an example. We're going to come back to this in a few minutes. But the first thing we look for is a stable baseline. So what is a stable baseline and how does it help demonstrate experimental control? Does anybody want to talk about anybody who uses single case design want to describe really quickly how they judge a stable baseline? Excuse me. I've got an example here that is from a study that I conducted. Looking across these baselines, how would you know what stable is? Stephanie, you want to give it a shot?
Based on your example, you mean?
You can use this example, but you can talk about generally if you want to.
Well, generally, stable is what it sounds like. It's kind of a level, a generally level amount of on your data. You're not trending. Well, depending on what you're looking for, you're not trending upward. Right. You're not too up and down. You want to show typically you want to look for 3 in a row that are relatively stable in that they're close to the same level.
Yeah, there you go. So we're looking, so if you look at this top example, the very top graph in this series, this is a series of 4. Look at the very top one. This graph is extremely stable in the beginning, right? It's all very consistent, which is a part of stability, but also stability is looking across even when it becomes a little bit more variable right before intervention. It does not have variability that shows an increasing trend. Even when the data goes up, it also goes back down. And so there's variability happening there, but it's not variability that makes you think that you're falling outside of the norm for this individual for baseline. The decreasing or flat trend is also very important, because if you have an increasing trend, then it's going to be difficult for you to say that the change, whatever was happening with the student changing the data, wasn't already happening before the introduction of the intervention. So when I look at this data, just to give you a little orientation to this type of graph, when a line is introduced, there's a change between the different conditions. So baseline condition is before the line, the very first vertical line. And for the second graph down, it's staggered. So the intervention is not introduced until later, after the first intervention is done, and that's moved into a maintenance phase. Then the intervention is introduced for the second participant in this case. Okay, and it continues down all the way through 4 separate participants in this case. So there's various things we can look at here. We want to know about condition length. We want to know that there's enough information in each condition to establish an understanding of what's happening there. So in baseline, 3 to 5 is standard. 5 is definitely better. But if you do have variability, you tend to need more data to really understand what the trends are showing you. After that, you're looking at level and trend, which we just talked about. Okay, what is the level, and then what is the trend? What's happening up or down? Is the data moving in a particular direction? Immediacy of effect is another thing we would take a look at when looking at the difference between conditions. Okay, when we're looking at baseline, what happens when intervention is introduced? Is there an immediate effect, or is the effect more gradual? Either way, you're going to have some implications for talking about the functional relation in the end. Okay, and then finally, just the variability of the data in general. Sometimes that tells you something important about what's happening, and sometimes it really actually is a problem for the internal validity of the study. So you have to pay attention.
Ask a question here.
Yeah, of course.
So in this specific study, just so that I get a sense of how it can be applied to my own case, what were the data? Like, what does each dot represent in terms of data?
Yeah, good question. I'll go over this one, and from here on, we'll just assume that everything along the bottom of the graph, when you're measuring across the x-axis there, you're looking at sessions, so individual implementations of the intervention as time passes. And you'll see that there aren't data collected in every session for every participant, and that's why this particular design is multiple probe, not multiple baseline. Probe just means that you're not frustrating the student by continuing to test them and test them and test them. Instead, you're checking back in to make sure that it's confirming what you already know. Then along, when you're talking about the measure, which is the dependent variable that's running up your y-axis there, you've got a measure of how many independent correct responses to a comprehension questions around a text. And so that is a consistent number each time across all 4 of these graphs. And it's how many of the questions they independently got correct. Did I explain that well enough? I know it's very small, but I kept it that way because instead of digging into the details here, we have to keep moving, but I will be happy to go over this with anybody who's interested and talk a little bit more about that research. Great question. So let's talk about this. This might help to understand a little bit. Down at the bottom, you have an ABA design. This is a different approach. It's a reversal. Instead of what we just looked at, which was multiple baseline across participants. This one's a reversal. So you have just a single participant. You have a condition A, which is baseline. You have a condition B, which is intervention. And then you have a condition A, which is a return to baseline. Okay, whenever the letters repeat, that means it's the same exact conditions. Okay, so when I say A, B, it's baseline intervention 1, okay, baseline intervention 1, and the interventions don't change. If I were to say A, B, C, that means it's baseline, intervention 1, and then intervention 2. there would be another condition beyond what's happening in intervention 1. So if you talk about just an A-B design, what would be wrong with that? What questions would you have? If a student came to you, which I've had many students be like, hey, aren't I already doing single case design right now? I have this, like, I took baseline data and then I have my intervention data. That would be an A-B design. Anybody think of what's wrong? I'll give you a clue. It has to do with replication. Can anybody?
Right, Katie, you can't really tell if the variable is the one that's actually causing the change or if it's something else. Or
Yeah, thank you so much, Kimberly. That's exactly right. So you do have a demonstration that something's happening, but you really don't know what it's attributed to. That's exactly right. How about A, B, C? I mean, it's very similar to AB, correct? If you're looking at baseline, then you've observed a change, and you think that it is because of intervention, but you actually don't know for sure, because then you're moving on to a totally different intervention. Okay, new conditions, without ever confirming or replicating that first instance. So there are many types of single case designs, and I'm not going to try to drive you nuts with all the different kinds, because there's a lot of different ways you could go here. But what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about 3 major types of single case designs: the reversal that we just saw, multiple baseline, multiple probe, which is the first one we took a look at. And then we're going to look at alternating treatment multi-element. And I'll give you one little teaser for the next brown bag, which has a really interesting design that's sort of new on the scene. And so I'm excited to share that with you. Adam's Carrion is our colleague, and he's doing some research in that area. So we'll talk about these today. So you can go back and take a look at these examples. They may help you when you're talking about what is not really single case design. We just talked about them a little bit. But you can dig back into that in your own time and thinking about why something may not be single case design, but it's close. And some of them have similar characteristics, but it's not quite there. So remember that a reversal design, the criteria for a reversal design, the behavior can be reversed. Reversing the behavior won't cause harm to the participants. And you see here, we've got baseline positive attention, baseline positive attention being something that they deemed would not negatively affect the student if they withdrew it, in the intervention state. So it was like this extra positive attention. Data analysis would be all about that stable baseline. Okay, how does it help demonstrate experimental control? You are taking a look at what's already happening without any question about whether or not that is going to change. So they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 points of data there in condition A, right? That's a good amount of data. Is there a change in level significantly? No, because we're between our first and our last data point, there's not a large change in that level, okay, even though there is some variability there. Is there a change in trend? Also no, okay, that we've got the trend may sort of look like it's a little higher, and if anything, it's sort of condensing and coming down to more what that last data point is there at the end. So that's where we are in baseline for this intervention. So you take a look at that, and then you look at the change between conditions. All right, is there a significant change? And this one looks like, yes, there was a clear and significant change. So weak versions of reversal designs, and you have that ABA up there as a demonstration. It's fairly weak because it doesn't give you multiple replications of that effect. It's really just the one. Okay, so you're getting to see the establishment of baseline, you're getting to see the reversal back down, but typically it's a little bit stronger to have a different combination that does A, B, A, B, A, B. You know, people will switch them back and forth and try to interrupt the pattern, try to make sure that they're demonstrating experimental control for whatever their particular intervention is. And sometimes it's based on the intervention, what's going to really demonstrate the most control. Another one would be BAB, where there's no baseline to demonstrate the need for the intervention. And then you're jumping in and demonstrating an effect, but it's a little bit more problematic. So the strongest versions of this, right, would be more ABAB, and then variations on the theme. So I see you guys are with me on that one. I'm not going to go into too much detail there. There are unique applications of reversal. Definitely, you know, we've already talked about ABC, adding more than one treatment. That can definitely be done, but you need to do it in such a way that there are multiple replications that really demonstrate what's happening with each one of the different interventions. There's also some multi-element designs that we'll talk about in a little bit, or you can explore in your own time. And the strongest will always replicate with each intervention and make sure that they're confirming the effects. So now let's talk about multiple baseline design. Multiple baseline is exploring, remember, across either participants, settings, behaviors. It's staggered in its implementation to show how the effect is taking place separately for each participant or each element that you're examining. And it's typically used when the behavior cannot be reversed or it ethically should not be reversed. Okay, so an example of when it could not be reversed might be you're teaching students a particular comprehension skill and they are going to generalize that across other things. So you really can't reverse it. You wouldn't be able to just take away, they've built that skill, now they have that skill and you can't reverse it, right? The other thing is it ethically should not be. So say you introduce a support for a student who is self-injurious. Okay, you would not ethically want to put that student in a situation where you're taking away the intervention and putting them at risk. Weak applications of multiple baseline, simultaneous treatment, right? So not having a staggered baseline. We've already talked about that and why that is not really showing experimental control. Generalization occurs during baseline prior to replication, and that's something that you really want to watch in your baselines, is using the baseline of subsequent participants or subsequent replications to confirm the baseline every time something happens with one of the other participants. Just making sure that you can confirm what's happening. All right, so we've covered this a little bit, but you can use participants, right? And so in this case, you may have, I don't know, I've seen as many as 10, I think participants use this way when it's across participants, but typically it's usually 3 to 5, right? 3 is what establishes a functional relation according to the quality standards for single case design, but more is stronger. Across behaviors is very typical, especially when you're looking at students with disabilities and you're interested in changing a particular learning behavior. Multiple baseline across settings is very useful when you're talking about generalization. You want to make sure that what you design has the student's end goal in mind. So if the student is really interested in taking these skills outside the classroom, then sometimes it's helpful to look at them, the implementation in different environments and how that translates for the student into success with this particular intervention. Multiple probe is what I gave you an example of before. Instead of, as in multiple baseline, collecting data every single session, right, for every student, it sometimes is detrimental to the student. It can be for a number of reasons. A probe may be more appropriate. And so that's where multiple probe can happen. It's the same in every other way, except that the data is discontinuous. And usually in the graphs, you can tell that when you don't see them connected together, and you can tell that there's gaps. Alternating treatment design is another really interesting one that you guys might be might want to explore with a student. It's the rapid alternation of two treatment conditions. You establish a baseline, and then you have two conditions that you go back and forth between, and you sort of check out, what's happening between those two. For example, self-monitoring versus teacher praise. What's happening between those two. And I think the demonstration I have up there is, phone call reminders versus instructional placards. Which one of these things is going to be more effective for helping someone take their pills that they need to take? Okay, so we're changing a very small behavior, but we're trying to measure the effects for this individual using alternating treatments. Multi-element, used to compare more than one intervention or treatment condition. It's particularly popular in functional analysis for behavior analysis, because it helps you examine how behavior occurs under different conditions and in different contingencies, so you can have just multiple things that you're trying out. But it often omits the baseline phase. So we'll see that in just a second. The data analysis is all about the split in the data patterns. So when you look at this example, they would be taking a look at how the data is changing between these different lines, and how large is the split, and what do they consider to be a significant difference. Let's see. I think we're probably good on that, because I wanted to check the time. I think we're good. Changing criterion design is another one that you should be aware of. I'm not going to go into detail about this one because it's used a lot more in action research, but it's so useful for our teachers to know about this one. It's often used in classrooms when they're changing the contingency across one dimension. So in other words, if I've got one phase and I'm reinforcing 4 correct answers, right? And that's where I am. But then I want to introduce phase 2, where I reinforce 8 correct answers, and then phase 3, where I reinforce 12 correct answers. It's sort of more about behavior shaping and responding to the student and the condition in front of you. It's rarely used in published research, but it may be really useful for some of our EDS students. So something to consider. Other treatment comparisons, and we talked about some of these, but there's parallel designs, there's different kinds of reversals that you can introduce, simultaneous treatment design. But what I really want to explore with you all is this one. And I think, Adam, you're with us, right? I didn't see you pop up on my screen, but
I'm here.
Hey. Okay, so guys, this is Adam Carrion. If you haven't met him before, I wanted to show you this really interesting single case design that he's experimenting with right now. And this is one of his graphs. It's called Repeated Measures Acquisition Design, and he'll talk to us a little bit about that.
So it's actually a combination of two. So this was, to give some background, it was exploring the effectiveness of a virtual reality intervention. And then we were also exploring at the same time the preference of whether somebody wanted to wear an Oculus headset or use an iPad. So what you see here is the first part is the repeated measures acquisition design. So what we basically do in this, it's kind of a crazy looking graph, because what it is that you pre-post every single session. So if you see the dot on the bottom and going up, the dot on the bottom for each line is the baseline, or hopefully the baseline on the bottom. And then the dot on the top is the post test for each intervention. So then you see did you put all the graphs in there? Or is it just this the one you put in there?
I didn't. I pulled this one. Did you
Okay.
want me to pull up the others? Because I can share a different screen.
Well, the other one just shows the other one shows the preference. So this is just the pre-post for each individual student across the intervention. So each student color is there. And so you see their progress using each different type of device. But the other one shows the device. So I don't know if that is of interest.
Wow.
Or
Well, and so that would be a good thing. I think we can move on and show that one next time we get
Mhm.
together, which I've just found out that Adam's going to be doing the brown bag for us in January. So if you want to know more about his design and how he's using it, definitely plan on attending that next brown bag. Adam, so you're establishing baseline in this scenario every single session.
Correct. And then we also have technically the measurement across the entire thing, because the other part of the design is the simultaneous treatments design, because we use that to decide whether or not there was preference to which device. And by that, we kind of mixed, we would randomize what device they got, and then the next session we would give them the option. And then we measured pre-post during each session. That way we got an idea of whether or not the individual device was making a difference. And we also got to see over time whether or not the intervention was working.
Yeah, I love it. I like that you were including in that student preference measure as well. That's pretty neat. Any questions about that before we move on? Because I'm sure that I have lots of questions. I want Adam to go through the whole thing, but that will be coming up. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it. So I'm very quickly going to talk about assessing single case design write-ups and in papers when you're looking at student work. What are you looking for when you analyze this information, when students are coming back to you with this, right? You obviously are going to have the visual to analyze, and you're going to be looking at that. But it's very important to know that publishable work in single case design has to have sufficient details for replication. You have to know enough about the participants, the condition, the methods, and the limitations to be able to replicate this work, because single case design is highly dependent on different replications by different research teams and around the country, different scenarios that we can combine together to say, here's where we think we are with this particular research or educational practice, and whether or not we feel like it has a strong or a weak evidence base. What do we need to know more of, and how do we gather that information? So if it's not detailed enough, and we don't know enough about who this research was conducted with and the specific conditions, it's very difficult to replicate, and then sometimes can't be easily published. Experimental control, right? You're watching for replication, at least 3 demonstrations of replication, adequate data points per phase, which, remember, the general rule is 5, but you can have some fluctuation there. Inter-observer agreement is another thing that we have standards for, which is you're collecting it in at least 20% of sessions per phase across the whole study. All right. And then for each one of those with the agreement should be at least 80%. And those standards, I think, are, always changing just slightly, and everyone's always looking for, more than that. But if it's lower than 80%, then you may get some serious questions about your measurement and the internal validity of your study. And finally, the functional relation. So using that visual analysis to look at these different elements, trend, level, data overlap, which is not one that we talked about today, but is a really interesting topic. There's a lot of percentage of non-overlapping data that is being used when we publish single case design research these days. And it's an interesting way to show the impact of the intervention that I think that a lot of qualitative researchers who aren't familiar with single case design really appreciate. Okay, I'll just put it that way. Variability and immediacy, consistency, and then sort of projected, where do we think the student's going to go, which is also what we call maintenance data. How are they maintaining their skills, and how might they be generalizing their skills beyond the intervention? So all of those things are interesting data to put in for a study. So I'm going to leave you with some resources. Okay, this presentation I'm obviously going to share with you. But I wanted to tell you about the gold standard for single case design textbooks. Ledford and Gast published a textbook on single case design research methodology. If you are interested in this, definitely pick up that textbook. It details every piece of single case design. And I think you'll find it really valuable. If you ever have any questions, there's so many of us who use single case design. We're always here. You can reach out and we can chat. But then beyond that, there is the What Works Clearinghouse technical document for single case design. If you wanted to look in detail at the standards for quality, I do have a number of slides that, like I said, those of you who may have missed it in the very beginning, this PowerPoint I'm going to share with you is much longer than what I've presented to you today, but I've included a lot of slides on things like the What Works Clearinghouse standards for single case design, and you can take a look at those in more detail. I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but we're happy to ever talk through any specific scenarios if you want. You can ask Stephanie. I love to talk about this stuff. I don't know why, but I just do. So reach out to me anytime. But again, Adam, Stephanie, Cindy, like so many of us use single case. So do you all have any questions? Maybe what
There's
are
a
your burning
question in the
questions
chat.
would be a better
There's one question in the chat.
question for you.
Katie, there's one in the chat.
Is there? Sorry, I didn't have it up. Okay.
Sorry, it's my question.
Mhm. Oh no, Peggy. I think I lost your audio, Peggy. But I can see your question. It's a great question. So can the interventions be more close together in nature, like using a phone or text reminder? Yes, they can. I definitely think that's a good measure. The only thing you'd be worried about is if the behaviors are so close in nature that there's going to be generalization from one to the other, then you might have concerns there. But I think you can, depending on the behaviors, you can definitely measure things that are very, very closely related. I think that most interventions in alternating treatment are, right? It'll be like two types of praise, but delivered in two separate ways. So that's a great question. Anybody else have anything to add on that? Alternating treatment designs are always so interesting too, because you get a lot more information. I feel like it gives you more context than just taking a look at the single intervention and saying, yep, it works. But then sometimes when you're, one of my favorite things about single case design is that when you put it together, you're really marrying it to the situation and the conditions. So you have a particular intervention, and when you go into classrooms and you see how it's working, teachers are, generally using, sure, they're using this intervention, but they're also using this other thing that's really close, and they say sometimes does the same thing. Then alternating treatment is perfect for that. And sometimes there's designs where reversal is just the perfect thing. It's going to measure exactly what you want to know. So that's my favorite thing about single case design, is that you can really tailor it to what you want to know. Oh, I'm sorry. Peggy says that her internet's not great right now, but she says she got the general info. Okay, good. Oculus versus iPad is similar to what you're thinking. Good. Okay, so good. If you were interested in how Adam is doing that or some of his research, he's going to share that in January. Yay, Adam.
So can you, using the single student as their own control, could you test different treatments on them moving forward? Or would, like, if you started using one treatment and then you switch to another, would all of a sudden it be kind of confounded because you're using different treatments? Or do you have to wait for an extended period to say, okay, after that treatment seemed to work okay. Now we're not going to do anything with the student. Let's see if he reestablishes a baseline for a while, and then we're going to try this new technique out, or?
That is a great question. So this was one of the things I'm always talking to teachers about, when teachers start an intervention and they're like, well, I did it twice and it's just not working, and they're ready to switch, jump ship. That's some of what I hear you're talking about a little bit. Part of the things that knowing about single case design will do to help teachers is help them understand that for you to really get a picture of what's happening in that particular condition, you have to have a certain number of data points. You have to give it time to really understand what's happening there. And then if you're ready to switch to a different intervention, David, that would be like that ABC implementation. That would be one baseline, intervention 1, intervention 2, but to make it a strong design, you wouldn't stop there. You would maybe go back to intervention B. You'd maybe reintroduce baseline. Then maybe you'd jump into intervention C. See what happens when you go straight from baseline to intervention C, and really have strong experimental control over each one of those separate interventions so that you can really describe what's happening. That's a great question, though. I feel like that's where a lot of our teachers want to go, right? They're like, I want to just try everything in my bag. I'm ready to try this. I'm ready to try this. I'm ready to try this. But it's hard to know what's really having the effect. When you're working with teachers in classrooms, sometimes it doesn't matter. They're ready to throw everything in the kitchen sink at the student, and it won't impact or negatively affect the intervention if there's a lot of other supports and elements there. However, in research, when we're trying to isolate each intervention component to understand what the impact is, we really do need designs that are thinking ahead about experimental control. Does that help answer your question?
It does. And then I have another question that's not related to that question, but it's another one, but I'll give other people a chance to ask a question so I'm not dominating the space. But if no one does, I'll be ready.
Okay. I also want to mention, I forgot to mention changing criterion. Don't forget about that one. That's another one where if you feel like instead of introducing a whole new intervention, you're just like, I'm ready to sort of change the conditions around this a little bit. Then you would introduce a phase line, and that would be the criterion for mastery would change, and you would measure again. And like I said, that's not typically published in single case design, but teachers can use it to great effect. Who else has questions, comments? Maybe they're not even questions for me. Maybe they're questions for other folks who use single case, who are also just ninjas. I love working with you guys on this stuff. When Adam told me about this design he was trying out, I was just like, I'm so excited to know more.
Okay, I have another question. I think
Go for it.
I waited long enough. All right, so this question is a little bit more about just try to make sure I understand what is and what isn't single case design. So in your case, single case design often is a single participant because there's just not a lot of participants who maybe exhibit the same characteristics, or in a single classroom, maybe there is only a few participants. But let's just say in a hypothetical situation, you're a teacher and you've got several classes and they're all relatively high needs kids. I don't want to say they're all the same, but I'm just trying to think, like, if you're going to try a different, let's say you have a few different interventions and then one of the classes you don't do an intervention, you call that a control group. So you're trying a few different interventions. So this is kind of like a quasi-experimental design, but just with a lot of participants in each classroom. Would that still be a single case design because you're trying to address a certain need that all of these students across your classes have with different strategies? Or is that just a case study? What do you think on that?
Great question. Okay, so let's break down the first part. When you asked about the number of participants, anybody chime in, okay, who's used single case design, but I feel like I don't think I've ever had to make a decision about changing my research design about a lack of participants from multiple multiple baseline or multiple probe, where I'm looking for 3 to 5 participants. Remember, it's just a really small number, to be able to examine what I want to know. Okay. Versus the, I'm looking at 1 or maybe 2 students who I'm doing a reversal with to really understand what's happening there. Most of my decisions around what kind of design I'm using within single case is dictated by the kind of question that I have and the kind of conditions around the variables that are in place. Okay, so we talked through a couple of scenarios, but I don't think that I would not say the majority of my research is not with just one person. The majority of my research is with 3 to 5 students at a time. And so we'll take a look at changing a particular element. So in that one case, I'm going to test all of these students on their listening comprehension, for example. Okay. And I'm establishing a baseline for 3 students for listening comprehension. And we're reading stories and I'm asking them these questions. Then with participant 1, I'm going to introduce that intervention, see what happens, continue to collect baseline on the other 2 participants. And then once I feel confident that I know what happened with participant 1, I can introduce that intervention with participant 2. That's the staggered baseline I was telling you about. Okay. And then introduce the same for participant 3. And that's typical of my research. Anybody else feel differently and want to chime in? You go right ahead. But that was the first part of your question. The second part of your question is a really interesting one. And I get teachers ask me this a lot, right? I want to know what's happening. I want to test it out with this whole class group. You have qualitative analysis that you can do with smaller groups of students. And I am not the person to ask about what that analysis is, but there are people in this call that can answer that question. When you have a smaller group of students, but using one class that is not, it's not randomly assigned who is the control, that can be problematic, and you know about all that. What I'm going to tell you though is that teachers will often say, can I introduce an intervention for students? Like, I want to try out this new curriculum. All right. If you're using single case design, you have to remember that you need replication. So they'll say, well, I've got these three different groups and I'm going to introduce it to these 3 different groups. If you're going to do it in a staggered fashion, where they're going to one group, you're going to implement it and see what their, what happened with that implementation, then have a totally separate instance of the effect that you can measure with a different group, then another instance of the effect. That can be single case design. But if you're implementing one intervention at the same time, you're not getting multiple replications. It's really just I'm measuring baseline, and then, or even like I've got my control group and then I'm taking a look at the effect over here. That's not single case design. That would be a different kind of analysis. Anybody else want to add?
Built-in replication is really important. Now, this might be more with smaller numbers because generalizability is more difficult. But if you had larger sample sizes, and I know in your case you don't oftentimes, in this case, you might not need replicability within the same study, but because replicability within your study is requisite to single case design, then maybe you would be moving away from a single case design at that point because replicability is not something that you're building in. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, I think just to clarify, make sure that you distinguish for yourself, but the difference between that internal replication, the one that we're talking about for this, the replication of the effect, versus replications like for external validity, where I think that I can replicate this with others. We're talking about more of that replication that happens within the study, that's going to show the effect multiple times. That's going to be different than the replications that are happening. Like, I want to be able to generalize to other folks.
I understand.
Am I understanding your question right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And if I'm not, call me out, because I'm
okay.
I'm sure somebody else could jump in and help me with it too, if you've got more to add.
I think that one part of his question is that you could theoretically do it for 30 kids in a classroom, but you would have a hard time being able to explain that all 30 of those kids are very similar. And then the other risk you run is that the maturation, like if 5 kids have already gone and you're now introducing it to a 6th, 7th, 8th kid, you can't really say that that kid hasn't seen the other kids do it and then justify that internal validity of your argument. So in theory, you could have a 30-person single subject. It would be a lot of work for you and you'd have to justify a lot of things when you're writing it up, but that's typically that you just can't find that many kids of the same nature.
That's a great point. It's like you can do it, but then you may actually have a stronger demonstration of the effect by just using a smaller number of students and focusing on them. That way you have a little bit more control over some of those other variables. Great point. Thank you. Great questions, you guys. Well, I think we are, our time is up. We're going to turn to a pumpkin in 1 minute. If there's anything you guys still have questions about, please email me directly. I'll be happy to either answer it myself or send you in the right direction. But thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This was great.
You're very welcome. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.